Author's Preface. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Author's Preface. I make so bold as to believe that the faculty, or the habit, of correctly observing the characters of men is a rare one. I have not even found within my experience that the faculty, or the habit, of correctly observing so much as the faces of men is a general one by any means. The two commonest mistakes in judgment that I suppose to arise from the former default are the confounding of shyness with arrogance, a very common mistake indeed, and the not understanding that an obstinate nature exists in a perpetual struggle with itself. Mr. Dombey undergoes no violent change either in this book or in real life. A sense of his injustice is within him all along. The more he represses it, the more unjust he necessarily is. Internal shame and external circumstances may bring the contest to a close in a week or a day, but it has been a contest for years, and is only fought out after a long balance of victory. I began this book by the Lake of Geneva, and went on with it for some months in France before pursuing it in England. The association between the writing and the place of writing is so curiously strong in my mind that at this day, although I know in my fancy every stair in the little midshipman's house, and could swear to every pew in the church in which Florence was married, or to every young gentleman's bedstead in Dr. Blimber's establishment, I yet confusedly imagine Captain Cuttle as secluding himself from Mrs. McStinger among the mountains of Switzerland. Similarly, when I am reminded by any chance of what it was that the waves were always saying, my remembrance wanders for a whole winter night about the streets of Paris, as I restlessly did with a heavy heart on the night when I had written the chapter in which my little friend and I parted company. Chapter 1. Dombey and Son. Dombey sat in the corner of the darkened room in the great armchair by the bedside, and Son lay tucked up warm in a little basket bedstead, carefully disposed on a low settee immediately in front of the fire and close to it, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it was essential to toast him brown while he was very new. Dombey was about 48 years of age, Son about 48 minutes. Dombey was rather bald, rather red, and though a handsome, well-made man, too stern and pompous in appearance to be prepossessing. Son was very bald and very red, and though, of course, an undeniably fine infant, somewhat crushed and spotty in his general effect, as yet. On the brow of Dombey, time and his brother Care had set some marks, as on a tree that was to come down in good time. Remorseless twins they are for striding through their human forests, notching as they go, while the countenance of Son was crossed and recrossed, with 1,000 little creases, which the same deceitful time would take delight in smoothing out and wearing away with the flat part of his scythe, as a preparation of the surface for his deeper operations. Dombey, exulting in the long-looked-for event, jingled and jingled the heavy gold watch chain that depended from below his trim blue coat, whereof the buttons sparkled phosphorescently in the feeble rays of the distant fire. Son, with his little fists curled up and clenched, seemed in his feeble way to be squaring at existence for having come upon him so unexpectedly. "The house will once again, Mrs. Dombey," said Mr. Dombey, "be not only in name but in fact Dombey and Son. Dombey and Son." The words had such a softening influence that he appended a term of endearment to Mrs. Dombey's name, though not without some hesitation, as being a man but little used to that form of address, and said, "Mrs. Dombey, my dear." A transient flush of faint surprise overspread the sick lady's face as she raised her eyes towards him. "He will be christened Paul, my Mrs. Dombey, of course." She echoed feebly, "Of course," or rather expressed it by the motion of her lips, and closed her eyes again. "His father's name, Mrs. Dombey, and his grandfather's. I wish his grandfather were alive this day." And again he said, "Dombey and Son," in exactly the same tone as before. Those 3 words expressed the one idea of Mr. Dombey's life. The earth was made for Dombey and Son to trade in, and the sun and moon were made to give them light. Rivers and seas were formed to float their ships. Rainbows gave them promise of fair weather. Winds blew for or against their enterprises. Stars and planets circled in their orbits to preserve inviolate a system of which they were the centre. Common abbreviations took new meanings in his eyes, and had sole reference to them. A.D. had no concern with Anno Domini, but stood for Anno Dombey and Son. He had risen, as his father had before him, in the course of life and death, from Son to Dombey, and for nearly 20 years had been the sole representative of the firm. Of those years he had been married, 10, as some said, to a lady with no heart to give him, whose happiness was in the past, and who was content to bind her broken spirit to the dutiful and meek endurance of the present. Such idle talk was little likely to reach the ears of Mr. Dombey, whom it nearly concerned, and probably no one in the world would have received it with such utter incredulity as he, if it had reached him. Dombey and Son had often dealt in hides, but never in hearts. They left that fancy ware to boys and girls, and boarding schools and books. Mr. Dombey would have reasoned that a matrimonial alliance with himself must, in the nature of things, be gratifying and honourable to any woman of common sense. That the hope of giving birth to a new partner in such a house could not fail to awaken a glorious and stirring ambition in the breast of the least ambitious of her sex. That Mrs. Dombey had entered on that social contract of matrimony, almost necessarily part of a genteel and wealthy station, even without reference to the perpetuation of family firms, with her eyes fully open to these advantages. That Mrs. Dombey had had daily practical knowledge of his position in society. That Mrs. Dombey had always sat at the head of his table, and done the honours of his house in a remarkable ladylike and becoming manner. That Mrs. Dombey must have been happy. That she couldn't help it. Or, at all events, with one drawback. Yes, that he would have allowed. With only one, but that one certainly involving much. With the drawback of hope deferred. That hope deferred which, as the Scripture very correctly tells us, Mr. Dombey would have added in a patronising way. For his highest distinct idea, even of Scripture, if examined, would have been found to be that as forming part of a general whole, of which Dombey and Son formed another part. It was therefore to be commended and upheld. Maketh the heart sick. They had been married 10 years, and until this present day on which Mr. Dombey sat jingling and jingling his heavy gold watch chain in the great armchair by the side of the bed, had had no issue. To speak of, none worth mentioning. There had been a girl some 6 years before, and the child, who had stolen into the chamber unobserved, was now crouching timidly in a corner whence she could see her mother's face. But what was a girl to Dombey and Son? In the capital of the house's name and dignity, such a child was merely a piece of base coin that couldn't be invested, a bad boy, nothing more. Mr. Dombey's cup of satisfaction was so full at this moment, however, that he felt he could afford a drop or two of its contents, even to sprinkle on the dust in the bypath of his little daughter. So he said, "Florence, you may go and look at your pretty brother, if you like. I dare say. Don't touch him." The child glanced keenly at the blue coat and stiff white cravat, which, with a pair of creaking boots and a very loud ticking watch, embodied her idea of a father. But her eyes returned to her mother's face immediately, and she neither moved nor answered. Next moment the lady had opened her eyes and seen the child, and the child had run towards her, and standing on tiptoe, the better to hide her face in her embrace, had clung about her with a desperate affection very much at variance with her years. "Oh, Lord bless me!" said Mr. Dombey, rising testily. "A very ill-advised and feverish proceeding this, I am sure. I had better ask Dr. Peps if he'll have the goodness to step upstairs again. Perhaps I'll go down. I needn't beg you," he added, pausing for a moment at the settee before the fire, "to take particular care of this young gentleman, Mrs." "Blockett, sir," suggested the nurse, a simpering piece of faded gentility, who did not presume to state her name as a fact, but merely offered it as a mild suggestion. "Of this young gentleman, Mrs. Blockett." "No, sir, indeed. I remember when Miss Florence was born." Ay," said Mr. Dombey, bending over the basket bedstead, and slightly bending his brows at the same time. "Miss Florence was all very well, but this is another matter. This young gentleman has to accomplish a destiny, little fellow." As he thus apostrophized the infant, he raised one of his hands to his lips and kissed it. Then, seeming to fear that the action involved some compromise of his dignity, went awkwardly enough away. Dr. Parker Peps, one of the court physicians, and a man of immense reputation for assisting at the increase of great families, was walking up and down the drawing-room with his hands behind him, to the unspeakable admiration of the family surgeon, who had regularly puffed the case for the last 6 weeks among all his patients, friends, and acquaintances, as one to which he was in hourly expectation day and night of being summoned, in conjunction with Dr. Parker Peps. "Well, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps, in a round, deep, sonorous voice, muffled for the occasion, like the knocker, "do you find that your dear lady is at all roused by your visit?" "Stimulated, as it were," said the family practitioner faintly, bowing at the same time to the doctor, as much as to say, "Excuse my putting in a word, but this is a valuable connection." Mr. Dombey was quite discomfited by the question. He had thought so little of the patient that he was not in a condition to answer it. He said that it would be a satisfaction to him if Dr. Parker Peps would walk upstairs again. "Good. "We must not disguise from you, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps, "that there is a want of power in her Grace the Duchess. I beg your pardon, I confound names. I should say, in your amiable lady. That there is a certain degree of languor, and a general absence of elasticity, which we would rather not see," interposed the family practitioner, with another inclination of the head. "Quite so," said Dr. Parker Peps, "which we would rather not see. It would appear that the system of Lady Cankaby, excuse me, I should say of Mrs. Dombey, I confuse the names of cases." "So very numerous," murmured the family practitioner. "Can't be expected, I'm sure. Quite wonderful, if otherwise. Dr. Parker Peps's West End practice." "Thank you," said the doctor. "Quite so. It would appear, I was observing, that the system of our patient has sustained a shock, from which it can only hope to rally by a great and strong—" "And vigorous," murmured the family practitioner. "Quite so," assented the doctor, "and vigorous effort. Mr. Pilkins here, who from his position of medical adviser in this family, no one better qualified to fill that position, I am sure." "Oh!" murmured the family practitioner. "Praise from Sir Hubert Stanley." "You are good enough," returned Dr. Parker Peps, "to say so. Mr. Pilkins, who from his position is best acquainted with the patient's constitution in its normal state, an acquaintance very valuable to us in forming our opinions on these occasions, is of opinion with me that nature must be called upon to make a vigorous effort in this instance, and that if our interesting friend, the Countess of I beg your pardon, Mrs. Dombey, should not be—" "Able," said the family practitioner. "To make that effort successfully," said Dr. Parker Peps, "then a crisis might arise, which we should both sincerely deplore." With that they stood for a few seconds looking at the ground. Then, on the motion, made in dumb show, of Dr. Parker Peps, they went upstairs, the family practitioner opening the room door for that distinguished professional, and following him out with most obsequious politeness. To record of Mr. Dombey that he was not, in his way, affected by this intelligence, would be to do him an injustice. He was not a man of whom it could properly be said that he was ever startled or shocked, but he certainly had a sense within him that if his wife should sicken and decay, he would be very sorry, and that he would find a something gone from among his plate and furniture, and other household possessions, which was well worth the having, and could not be lost without sincere regret, though it would be a cool, businesslike, gentlemanly, self-possessed regret, no doubt. His meditations on the subject were soon interrupted, first by the rustling of garments on the staircase, and then by the sudden whisking into the room of a lady rather past the middle age than otherwise, but dressed in a very juvenile manner, particularly as to the tightness of her bodice, who, running up to him with a kind of screw in her face and carriage, expressive of suppressed emotion, flung her arms round his neck, and said in a choking voice, "My dear Paul, he's quite a Dombey." "Well, well," returned her brother, for Mr. Dombey was her brother, "I think he is like the family. Don't agitate yourself, Louisa." "It's very foolish of me," said Louisa, sitting down and taking out her pocket handkerchief, "but he's such a perfect Dombey. I never saw anything like it in my life." "But what is this about Fanny herself?" said Mr. Dombey. "How is Fanny?" "My dear Paul," returned Louisa, "it's nothing whatever. Take my word, it's nothing whatever. There is exhaustion, certainly, but nothing like what I underwent myself, either with George or Frederick. An effort is necessary, that's all. If dear Fanny were a Dombey. But I dare say she'll make it. I have no doubt she'll make it, knowing it to be required of her as a duty. Of course she'll make it. My dear Paul, it's very weak and silly of me, I know, to be so trembly and shaky from head to foot, but I am so very queer that I must ask you for a glass of wine and a morsel of that cake." Mr. Dombey promptly supplied her with these refreshments from a tray on the table. "I shall not drink my love to you, Paul," said Louisa. "I shall drink the little Dombey." "Good gracious! It's the most astonishing thing I ever knew in all my days. He's such a perfect Dombey." Quenching this expression of opinion in a short hysterical laugh which terminated in tears, Louisa cast up her eyes and emptied her glass. "I know it's very weak and silly of me," she repeated, "to be so trembly and shaky from head to foot, and to allow my feelings so completely to get the better of me, but I cannot help it. I thought I should have fallen out of the staircase window, as I came down from seeing dear Fanny, and that titty ickle sing." These last words originated in a sudden vivid reminiscence of the baby. They were succeeded by a gentle tap at the door. "Mrs. Chick," said a very bland female voice outside, "how are you now, my dear friend?" "My dear Paul," said Louisa in a low voice, as she rose from her seat, "it's Miss Tox, the kindest creature. I never could have got here without her. Miss Tox, my brother, Mr. Dombey. Paul, my dear, my very particular friend, Miss Tox." The lady thus specially presented was a long, lean figure, wearing such a faded air that she seemed not to have been made in what linen drapers call fast colours originally, and to have by little and little washed out. But for this she might have been described as the very pink of general propitiation and politeness. From a long habit of listening admirably to everything that was said in her presence, and looking at the speakers as if she were mentally engaged in taking off impressions of their images upon her soul, never to part with the same but with life, her head had quite settled on one side. Her hands had contracted a spasmodic habit of raising themselves of their own accord as in involuntary admiration. Her eyes were liable to a similar affection. She had the softest voice that ever was heard, and her nose, stupendously aquiline, had a little knob in the very centre or keystone of the bridge, whence it tended downwards towards her face, as in an invincible determination never to turn up at anything. Mrs. Tox's dress, though perfectly genteel and good, had a certain character of angularity and scantiness. She was accustomed to wear odd weedy little flowers in her bonnets and caps. Strange grasses were sometimes perceived in her hair, and it was observed by the curious of all her collars, frills, tuckers, wristbands, and other gossamer articles, indeed, of everything she wore which had two ends to it intended to unite, that the two ends were never on good terms, and wouldn't quite meet without a struggle. She had furry articles for winter wear, as tippets, boas, and muffs, which stood up on end in a rampant manner, and were not at all sleek. She was much given to the carrying about of small bags with snaps to them, that went off like little pistols when they were shut up, and when full dressed she wore round her neck the barrenest of lockets, representing a fishy old eye with no approach to speculation in it. These and other appearances of a similar nature had served to propagate the opinion that Miss Tox was a lady of what is called a limited independence, which she turned to the best account. Possibly her mincing gait encouraged the belief, and suggested that her clipping a step of ordinary compass into 2 or 3 originated in her habit of making the most of everything. "I am sure," said Miss Tox, with a prodigious curtsy, "that to have the honour of being presented to Mr. Dombey is a distinction which I have long sought, but very little expected at the present moment. My dear Mrs. Chick, may I say Louisa?" Mrs. Chick took Miss Tox's hand in hers, rested the foot of her wineglass upon it, repressed a tear, and said in a low voice, "Bless you." "My dear Louisa, then," said Miss Tox, "my sweet friend, how are you now?" "Better," Mrs. Chick returned. "Take some wine. You have been almost as anxious as I have been, and must want it, I am sure." Mr. Dombey, of course, officiated, and also refilled his sister's glass, which she, looking another way, and unconscious of his intentions, held straight and steady the while, and then regarded with great astonishment, saying, "My dear Paul, what have you been doing?" "Miss Tox, Paul," pursued Mrs. Chick, still retaining her hand, "knowing how much I have been interested in the anticipation of the event of to-day, has been working at a little gift for Fanny, which I promised to present. It is only a pincushion for the toilette table, Paul, but I do say, and will say, and must say, that Miss Tox has very prettily adapted the sentiment to the occasion. I call 'Welcome, little Dombey' poetry myself." "Is that the device?" inquired her brother. "That is the device," returned Louisa. "But do me the justice to remember, my dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, in a tone of low and earnest entreaty, "that nothing but I have some difficulty in expressing myself the dubiousness of the result would have induced me to take so great a liberty. Welcome, Master Dombey, would have been much more congenial to my feelings, as I am sure you know. But the uncertainty attendant on angelic strangers will, I hope, excuse what must otherwise appear an unwarrantable familiarity." Miss Tox made a graceful bend as she spoke, in favour of Mr. Dombey, which that gentleman graciously acknowledged. Even the sort of recognition of Dombey and Son, conveyed in the foregoing conversation, was so palatable to him, that his sister, Mrs. Chick, though he affected to consider her a weak, good-natured person, had perhaps more influence over him than anybody else. "Well," said Mrs. Chick, with a sweet smile, "after this I forgive Fanny everything." It was a declaration in a Christian spirit, and Mrs. Chick felt that it did her good. Not that she had anything particular to forgive in her sister-in-law, nor indeed anything at all, except her having married her brother, in itself a species of audacity, and her having, in the course of events, given birth to a girl instead of a boy, which, as Mrs. Chick had frequently observed, was not quite what she had expected of her, and was not a pleasant return for all the attention and distinction she had met with. Mr. Dombey being hastily summoned out of the room at this moment, the two ladies were left alone together. Miss Tox immediately became spasmodic. "I knew you would admire my brother. I told you so beforehand, my dear," said Louisa. Miss Tox's hands and eyes expressed how much. "And as to his property, my dear?" "Ah!" said Miss Tox, with deep feeling. "Immense!" "But his deportment, my dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, "his presence, his dignity. No portrait that I have ever seen of anyone has been half so replete with these qualities. Something so stately, you know, so uncompromising, so very wide across the chest, so upright. A pecuniary Duke of York, my love, and nothing short of it," said Miss Tox. "That's what I should designate him." "Why, my dear Paul," exclaimed his sister, as he returned, "you look quite pale. There's nothing the matter." "I am sorry to say, Louisa, that they tell me that Fanny—" "Now, my dear Paul," returned his sister, rising, "don't believe it. Do not allow yourself to receive a turn unnecessarily. Remember of what importance you are to society, and do not allow yourself to be worried by what is so very inconsiderately told you by people who ought to know better. Really, I'm surprised at him." "I hope I know, Louisa," said Mr. Dombey stiffly, "how to bear myself in the world." "Nobody better, my dear Paul. Nobody half so well. They would be ignorant and base indeed who doubted it." "Ignorant and base indeed," echoed Miss Tox softly. "If you have any reliance on my experience, Paul, you may rest assured that there is nothing wanting but an effort on Fanny's part. And that effort," she continued, taking off her bonnet and adjusting her cap and gloves in a businesslike manner, "she must be encouraged, and really, if necessary, urged to make. Now, my dear Paul, come upstairs with me." Mr. Dombey, who, besides being generally influenced by his sister for the reason already mentioned, had really faith in her as an experienced and bustling matron, acquiesced, and followed her at once to the sick chamber. The lady lay upon her bed as he had left her, clasping her little daughter to her breast. The child clung close about her, with the same intensity as before, and never raised her head, or moved her soft cheek from her mother's face, or looked on those who stood around, or spoke, or moved, or shed a tear. Restless without the little girl, the doctor whispered Mr. Dombey, "We found it best to have her in again." "Can nothing be done?" asked Mr. Dombey. The doctor shook his head. "We can do no more." The window stood open, and the twilight was gathering without. The scent of the restoratives that had been tried was pungent in the room, but had no fragrance in the dull and languid air the lady breathed. There was such a solemn stillness round the bed, and the two medical attendants seemed to look on the impassive form with so much compassion and so little hope, that Mrs. Chick was for the moment diverted from her purpose, but presently, summoning courage, and what she called presence of mind, she sat down by the bedside, and said in the low precise tone of one who endeavours to awaken a sleeper, "Fanny! Fanny!" There was no sound in answer but the loud ticking of Mr. Dombey's watch and Dr. Parker Peps's watch, which seemed in the silence to be running a race. "Fanny, my dear," said Mrs. Chick, with assumed lightness, "here's Mr. Dombey come to see you. Won't you speak to him? They want to lay your little boy, the baby, Fanny, you know. You have hardly seen him yet, I think, in bed. But they can't till you rouse yourself a little. Don't you think it's time you roused yourself a little, eh?" She bent her ear to the bed and listened, at the same time looking round at the bystanders and holding up her finger. "Eh?" she repeated. "What was it you said, Fanny? I didn't hear you." No word or sound in answer. Mr. Dombey's watch and Dr. Parker Pepps's watch seemed to be racing faster. "Now, really, Fanny, my dear," said the little sister, altering her position, and speaking less confidently and more earnestly, in spite of herself, "I shall have to be quite cross with you if you don't rouse yourself. It's necessary for you to make an effort, and perhaps a very great and painful effort, which you are not disposed to make. But this is a world of effort, you know, Fanny, and we must never yield when so much depends upon us. Come, try. I must really scold you if you don't." The race in the ensuing pause was fierce and furious. The watches seemed to jostle and to trip each other up. "Fanny," said Louisa, glancing round, with a gathering alarm, "only look at me. Only open your eyes to show me that you hear and understand me. Will you? Good heaven! Gentlemen, what is to be done?" The two medical attendants exchanged a look across the bed, and the physician, stooping down, whispered in the child's ear. Not having understood the purport of his whisper, the little creature turned her perfectly colourless face and deep dark eyes towards him, but without loosening her hold in the least. The whisper was repeated. "Mamma," said the child. The little voice, familiar and dearly loved, awakened some show of consciousness, even at that ebb. For a moment the closed eyelids trembled, and the nostril quivered, and the faintest shadow of a smile was seen. "Mamma!" cried the child, sobbing aloud. "Oh, dear mamma! Oh, dear mamma!" The doctor gently brushed the scattered ringlets of the child aside from the face and mouth of the mother. Alas, how calm they lay there! How little breath there was to stir them! Thus, clinging fast to that slight spar within her arms, the mother drifted out upon the dark and unknown sea that rolls round all the world. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. In which timely provision is made for an emergency that will sometimes arise in the best regulated families. "I shall never cease to congratulate myself," said Mrs. Chick, "on having said, when I little thought what was in store for us, really as if I was inspired by something, that I forgave poor dear Fanny everything. Whatever happens, that must always be a comfort to me." Mrs. Chick made this impressive observation in the drawing-room, after having descended thither from the inspection of the mantua-makers upstairs, who were busy on the family mourning. She delivered it for the behoof of Mr. Chick, who was a stout, bald gentleman, with a very large face, and his hands continually in his pockets, and who had a tendency in his nature to whistle and hum tunes, which, sensible of the indecorum of such sounds in a house of grief, he was at some pains to repress at present. "Don't you over-exert yourself, Lou," said Mr. Chick, "or you'll be laid up with spasms, I see." "Right-aloroo. Bless my soul, I forgot. We're here one day and gone the next." Mrs. Chick contented herself with a glance of reproof, and then proceeded with the thread of her discourse. "I am sure," she said, "I hope this heart-rending occurrence will be a warning to all of us to accustom ourselves to rouse ourselves, and to make efforts in time where they're required of us. There's a moral in everything, if we would only avail ourselves of it. It will be our own faults if we lose sight of this one." Mr. Chick invaded the grave silence which ensued on this remark with the singularly inappropriate air of "a cobbler there was," and checking himself in some confusion, observed that it was undoubtedly our own faults if we didn't improve such melancholy occasions as the present. "Which might be better improved, I should think, Mr. C," retorted his helpmate after a short pause, "than by the introduction either of the college hornpipe or the equally unmeaning and unfeeling remark of rumple-te-diddy, bow-wow-wow," which Mr. Chick had indeed indulged in under his breath, and which Mrs. Chick repeated in a tone of withering scorn. "Merely habit, my dear," pleaded Mr. Chick. "Nonsense! Habit!" returned his wife. "If you're a rational being, don't make such ridiculous excuses. Habit! If I was to get a habit, as you call it, of walking on the ceiling like the flies, I should hear enough of it, I dare say." It appeared so probable that such a habit might be attended with some degree of notoriety that Mr. Chick didn't venture to dispute the position. "Bow-wow-wow," repeated Mrs. Chick, with an emphasis of biting contempt on the last syllable. "More like a professional singer with the hydrophobia than a man in your station of life." "How's the baby, Lou?" asked Mr. Chick, to change the subject. "What baby do you mean?" demanded his wife. "The poor bereaved little baby," said Mr. Chick. "I don't know of any other." "You don't know of any other?" retorted Mrs. Chick. "More shame for you, I was going to say." Mr. Chick looked astonished. "I am sure the morning I have had with that dining room downstairs one mass of babies no one in their senses would believe." "One mass of babies!" repeated Mr. Chick, staring with an alarmed expression about him. "It would have occurred to most men," said Mrs. Chick, "that poor dear Fanny being no more, it becomes necessary to provide a nurse." "Oh, ah," said Mr. Chick. "True, such is life. I hope you are suited, my dear." "Indeed, I am not," said Mrs. Chick, "nor likely to be, so far as I can see. And in the meantime the poor child seems likely to starve to death. Paul is so very particular, naturally so, of course, having set his whole heart on this one boy, and there are so many objections to everybody that offers, that I can't see, myself, the least chance of an arrangement. Meanwhile, of course, the child is—" "Going to the very deuce," said Mr. Chick thoughtfully, "to be sure." Admonished, however, that he had committed himself by the indignation expressed in Mrs. Chick's countenance as the idea of a Dombey going there, and thinking to atone for his misconduct by a bright suggestion, he added, Couldn't something temporary be done with a teapot?" If he had meant to bring the subject prematurely to a close, he could not have done it more effectually. After looking at him for some moments in silent resignation, Mrs. Chick said she trusted he hadn't said it in aggravation, because that would do very little honour to his heart. She trusted he hadn't said it seriously, because that would do very little honour to his head. As in any case, he couldn't, however sanguine his disposition, hope to offer a remark that would be a greater outrage upon human nature in general. She would beg to leave the discussion at that point. She walked majestically to the window and peeped through the blind, attracted by the sound of wheels. Mr. Chick, finding that his destiny was, for the time, against him, said no more and walked off. But it was not always thus with Mr. Chick. He was often in the ascendant himself, and at those times punished Louisa roundly. In their matrimonial bickering they were, upon the whole, a well-matched, fairly balanced, give-and-take couple. It would have been, generally speaking, very difficult to have betted on the winner. Often, when Mr. Chick seemed beaten, he would suddenly make a start, turn the tables, clatter them about the ears of Mrs. Chick, and carry all before him. Being liable himself to similar unlooked-for checks from Mrs. Chick, their little contest usually possessed a character of uncertainty that was very animating. Miss Tox had arrived on the wheels just now alluded to, and came running into the room in a breathless condition. "My dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, "is the vacancy still unsupplied?" "You good soul, yes," said Mrs. Chick. "Then, my dear Louisa," returned Miss Tox, "I hope and believe, but in one moment, my dear, I'll introduce the party." Running downstairs again as fast as she had run up, Miss Tox got the party out of the hackney coach, and soon returned with it under convoy. It then appeared that she had used the word not in its legal or business acceptation, when it merely expresses an individual, but as a noun of multitude, or signifying many, for Miss Tox escorted a plump, rosy-cheeked, wholesome, apple-faced young woman, with an infant in her arms, a younger woman not so plump, but apple-faced also, who led a plump and apple-faced child in each hand, another plump and also apple-faced boy, who walked by himself, and finally a plump and apple-faced man, who carried in his arms another plump and apple-faced boy, whom he stood down on the floor and admonished in a husky whisper to kitch hold of his brother Johnny. "My dear Louisa," said Miss Tox, "knowing your great anxiety and wishing to relieve it, I posted off myself to the Queen Charlotte's Royal Married Females, which you had forgot, and put the question, was there anybody there that they thought would suit? No, they said there was not. When they gave me that answer, I do assure you, my dear, I was almost driven to despair on your account. But it did so happen that one of the royal married females, hearing the inquiry, reminded the matron of another who had gone to her own home, and who, she said, would in all likelihood be most satisfactory. The moment I heard this, and had it corroborated by the matron, excellent references, and unimpeachable character, I got the address, my dear, and posted off again." "Like the dear good Tox you are," said Louisa. "Not at all," returned Miss Tox. "Don't say so. Arriving at the house, the cleanest place, my dear, you might eat your dinner off the floor. I found the whole family sitting at table, and feeling that no account of them could be half so comfortable to you and Mr. Dombey as the sight of them all together, I brought them all away. This gentleman," said Miss Tox, pointing out the apple-faced man, "is the father. Will you have the goodness to come a little forward, sir?" The apple-faced man, having sheepishly complied with this request, stood chuckling and grinning in a front row. "This is his wife, of course," said Miss Tox, singling out the young woman with the baby. "How do you do, Polly?" "I'm pretty well, I thank you, ma'am," said Polly, by way of bringing her out dexterously. Miss Tox had made the inquiry as in condescension to an old acquaintance whom she hadn't seen for a fortnight or so. "I'm glad to hear it," said Miss Tox. "The other young woman is her unmarried sister who lives with them, and would take care of her children. Her name's Jemima. How do you do, Jemima?" "I'm pretty well, I thank you, ma'am," returned Jemima. "I'm very glad indeed to hear it," said Miss Tox. "I hope you'll keep so. 5 children, youngest 6 weeks. The fine little boy with the blister on his nose is the eldest. The blister, I believe," said Miss Tox, looking round upon the family, "is not constitutional, but accidental." The apple-faced man was understood to growl, "Flat iron." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Miss Tox. "Did you—" "Flat iron," he repeated. "Oh, yes," said Miss Tox. "Yes, quite true. I forgot. The little creature, in his mother's absence, smelt a warm flat iron. You're quite right, sir. You were going to have the goodness to inform me, when we arrived at the door, that you were by trade a—" "Stoker," said the man. "A choker," said Miss Tox, quite aghast. "Stoker," said the man. "Steam engine." "Oh, yes," returned Miss Tox, looking thoughtfully at him, and seeming still to have but a very imperfect understanding of his meaning. "And how do you like it, sir?" "Which, mum?" said the man. "That," replied Miss Tox. "Your trade." "Oh, pretty well, mum. The ashes sometimes gets in here," touching his chest, "and makes a man speak gruff, as at the present time. But it is ashes, mum, not crustiness." Miss Tox seemed to be so little enlightened by this reply as to find a difficulty in pursuing the subject; but Mrs. Chick relieved her by entering into a close private examination of Polly, her children, her marriage certificate, testimonials, and so forth. Polly coming out unscathed from this ordeal, Mrs. Chick withdrew with her report to her brother's room, and, as an emphatic comment on it and corroboration of it, carried the 2 rosiest little Toodles with her, Tootle being the family name of the apple-faced family. Mr. Dombey had remained in his own apartment since the death of his wife, absorbed in visions of the youth, education, and destination of his baby son. Something lay at the bottom of his cool heart, colder and heavier than its ordinary load. But it was more a sense of the child's loss than his own, awakening within him an almost angry sorrow. That the life and progress on which he built such hopes should be endangered in the outset by so mean a want, that Dombey and Son should be tottering for a nurse, was a sore humiliation. And yet, in his pride and jealousy, he viewed with so much bitterness the thought of being dependent for the very first step toward the accomplishment of his soul's desire on a hired serving woman who would be to the child, for the time, all that even his alliance could have made his own wife, that in every new rejection of a candidate he felt a secret pleasure. The time had now come, however, when he could no longer be divided between these two sets of feelings, the less so as there seemed to be no flaw in the title of Polly Toodle after his sister had set it forth, with many commendations on the indefatigable friendship of Miss Tox. "These children look healthy," said Mr. Dombey, "but to think of their some day claiming a sort of relationship to Paul." "Oh, but what relationship is there?" Louisa began. "Is there?" echoed Mr. Dombey, who had not intended his sister to participate in the thought that he had unconsciously expressed. "Is there, did you say, Louisa? Can there be, I mean?" "Why, none," said Mr. Dombey, sternly. "The whole world knows that, I presume. Grief has not made me idiotic, Louisa." "Take them away, Louisa. Let me see this woman and her husband." Mrs. Chick bore off the tender pair of Toodles, and presently returned with that tougher couple whose presence her brother had commanded. "My good woman," said Mr. Dombey, turning round in his easy chair, as one piece, and not as a man with limbs and joints, "I understand you are poor, and wish to earn money by nursing the little boy, my son, who has been so prematurely deprived of what can never be replaced. I have no objection to your adding to the comforts of your family by that means. So far as I can tell, you seem to be a deserving object. But I must impose one or two conditions on you before you enter my house in that capacity. While you are here, I must stipulate that you are always known as, say, as Richards, an ordinary name, and convenient. Have you any objection to be known as Richards? You had better consult your husband." As the husband did nothing but chuckle and grin, and continually draw his right hand across his mouth, moistening the palm, Mrs. Toodle, after nudging him twice or thrice in vain, dropped a curtsy and replied, that perhaps if she was to be called out of her name, it would be considered in the wages. "Oh, of course," said Mr. Dombey. "I desire to make it a question of wages altogether. Now, Richards, if you nurse my bereaved child, I wish you to remember this always. You will receive a liberal stipend in return for the discharge of certain duties, in the performance of which I wish you to see as little of your family as possible. When those duties cease to be required and rendered, and the stipend ceases to be paid, there is an end of all relations between us. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Toodle seemed doubtful about it, and as to Toodle himself, he had evidently no doubt whatever that he was all abroad. "You have children of your own," said Mr. Dombey. "It is not at all in this bargain that you need become attached to my child, or that my child need become attached to you. I don't expect or desire anything of the kind. Quite the reverse. When you go away from here, you will have concluded what is a mere matter of bargain and sale, hiring and letting, and will stay away. The child will cease to remember you, and you will cease, if you please, to remember the child." Mrs. Toodle, with a little more colour in her cheeks than she had before, said she hoped she knew her place. "I hope you do, Richards," said Mr. Dombey. "I have no doubt you know it very well. Indeed, it is so plain and obvious that it could hardly be otherwise. Louisa, my dear, arrange with Richards about money, and let her have it when and how she pleases. Mr. What's your name? A word with you, if you please." Thus arrested on the threshold, as he was following his wife out of the room, Tootle returned and confronted Mr. Dombey alone. He was a strong, loose, round-shouldered, shuffling, shaggy fellow, on whom his clothes sat negligently, with a good deal of hair and whisker, deepened in its natural tint perhaps by smoke and coal dust, hard, knotty hands, and a square forehead as coarse in grain as the bark of an oak. A thorough contrast in all respects to Mr. Dombey, who was one of those close-shaved, close-cut, moneyed gentlemen who are glossy and crisp like new banknotes, and who seem to be artificially braced and tightened as by the stimulating action of golden shower baths. "You have a son, I believe," said Mr. Dombey. "4 on 'em, sir. 4 hims and a her, all alive." "Why, it's as much as you can afford to keep them," said Mr. Dombey. "I could hardly afford but one thing in the world less, sir." "What is that?" "To lose 'em, sir." "Can you read?" asked Mr. Dombey. "Why, not particular, sir." "Write?" "With chalk, sir." "With anything?" "I could make shift to chalk a little bit, I think, if I was put to it," said Tootle, after some reflection. "And yet," said Mr. Dombey, "you are 2 and 3 and 30, I suppose." "Thereabouts, I suppose, sir," answered Tootle, after much reflection. "Then why don't you learn?" asked Mr. Dombey. "So I'm a-going to, sir. One of my little boys is going to learn me when he's old enough, and been to school himself." "Well," said Mr. Dombey, after looking at him attentively, and with no great favour, as he stood gazing round the room, principally round the ceiling, and still drawing his hand across his mouth. "You heard what I said to your wife just now?" "Polly heard it," said Tootle, jerking his hat over his shoulder in the direction of the door, with an air of perfect confidence in his better half. "It's all right." "As you appear to leave everything to her," said Mr. Dombey, frustrated in his intention of impressing his views still more distinctly on the husband as the stronger character, "I suppose it is of no use my saying anything to you." "Not a bit," said Tootle. "Polly heard it. She's awake, sir." "I won't detain you any longer, then," returned Mr. Dombey, disappointed. "Where have you worked all your life?" "Mostly underground, sir, till I got married. I come to the level then. I'm going on one of these here railroads when they come into full play." As he added in one of his hoarse whispers, "We mean to bring up little Byler to that line." Mr. Dombey inquired haughtily who little Byler was. "The elder on 'em, sir," said Tootle, with a smile. "It ain't a common name." "Sir, much, sir, that when he was took to church the gentleman said it weren't a Christian one, and he couldn't give it, but we always calls him Byler just the same, for we don't mean no harm, not we." "D'you mean to say, man," inquired Mr. Dombey, looking at him with marked displeasure, "that you have called a child after a boiler?" "No, no, sir," returned Tootle, with a tender consideration for his mistake. "I should hope not. No, sir. Arter a biler, sir. The steam engine was almost as good as a godfather to him, and so we called him Byler. Don't you see?" As the last straw breaks the laden camel's back, this piece of underground information crushed the sinking spirits of Mr. Dombey. he motioned his child's foster father to the door, who departed by no means unwillingly, and then turning the key, paced up and down the room in solitary wretchedness. It would be harsh, and perhaps not altogether true, to say of him that he felt these rubs and gratings against his pride more keenly than he had felt his wife's death. But certainly they impressed that event upon him with force and communicated to it weight and bitterness. It was a rude shock to his sense of property in his child that these people, the mere dust of the earth as he thought them, should be necessary to him, and it was natural that in proportion as he felt disturbed by it, he should deplore the occurrence which had made them so. Some philosophers tell us that selfishness is the root of all but our best loves and affections. Mr. Dombey's infant child was from the beginning so distinctly important to him as being part of himself, or, which was the same thing, of Dombey and Son, that there is no doubt his parental affection might have been very easily traced, like many another superstructure of fair fame, to a very low foundation. But it is certain that there had begun to spring up in his habitually frigid breast a current of anxieties and cares of which this infant was the source, that impelled the dominant springs of his character to a new action, and perhaps set one or two others in motion that had never been at work. For all his starched, impenetrable dignity and composure, he wiped blinding tears from his eyes as he did so, and often said, with an emotion of which he would not, for the world, have had a witness, "Poor little fellow." It may have been characteristic of Mr. Dombey's pride that he pitied himself through the child. Not poor me, not poor widower, confiding by constraint in the wife of an ignorant hind who had been working, mostly underground, all his life, and yet at whose door death had never knocked, and at whose poor table 4 sons daily sit. But poor little fellow. Those words being on his lips, it occurred to him, and it is an instance of the strong attraction with which his hopes and fears and all his thoughts were tending to one centre, that a great temptation was being placed in this woman's way. Her infant was a boy too. Now, would it be possible for her to change them? Though he was soon satisfied that he had dismissed the idea as romantic and unlikely, though possible, there was no denying he could not help pursuing it so far as to entertain within himself a picture of what his condition would be if he should discover such an imposture when he was grown old; whether a man so situated would be able to pluck away the result of so many years of usage, confidence, and belief from the impostor, and endow a stranger with it. But it was idle speculating thus. It couldn't happen. In a moment afterwards he determined it could, but that such women were constantly observed, and had no opportunity given them for the accomplishment of such design, even when they were so wicked as to entertain it. In another moment he was remembering how few such cases seemed to have ever happened. In another moment he was wondering whether they ever happened and were not found out. As his unusual emotion subsided, these misgivings gradually melted away, though so much of their shadow remained behind. that he was constant in his resolution to look closely after Richards himself, without appearing to do so. Being now in an easier frame of mind, he regarded the woman's station as rather an advantageous circumstance than otherwise, by placing in itself a broad distance between her and the child, and rendering their separation easy and natural. Meanwhile, terms were ratified and agreed upon between Mrs. Chick and Richards, with the assistance of Miss Tox. And Richards, being with much ceremony invested with the Dombey baby, as if it were an order, resigned her own, with many tears and kisses, to Jemima. Glasses of wine were then produced to sustain the drooping spirits of the family, and Miss Tox, busying herself dispensing tastes to the younger branches, bred them up to their father's business with such surprising expedition that one made chokers of them in a matter of minutes. "You'll take a glass yourself, sir, won't you?" said Miss Tox, as Tootle appeared. "Thank'ee, mum," said Tootle, "since you are suppressing." "And you're very glad to leave your dear good wife in such a comfortable house, ain't you, sir?" said Miss Tox, nodding and winking at him stealthily. "No, mum," said Tootle. "Here's wishing of her back again." Polly cried more than ever at this. So Mrs. Chick, who had her matronly apprehensions that this indulgence in grief might be prejudicial to the little Dombey, "acid, indeed," she whispered Miss Tox, hastened to the rescue. "Your little child will thrive charmingly with your sister Jemima, Richards," said Mrs. Chick, "and you have only to make an effort. This is a world of effort, you know, Richards, to be very happy indeed. You have been already measured for your mourning, haven't you, Richard?" "Yes, ma'am," sobbed Polly. "And it'll fit beautifully, I know," said Mrs. Chick, "for the same young person has made me many dresses, the very best materials too." "Lor, you'll be so smart," said Miss Tox, "that your husband won't know you, will you, sir?" "I should know her," said Tootle gruffly, "anyhows and anywheres." Tootle was evidently not to be bought over. "As to living, Richards, you know," pursued Mrs. Chick, "why, the very best of everything will be at your disposal. You will order your little dinner every day, and anything you take a fancy to, I'm sure, will be as readily provided as if you were a lady." "Yes, to be sure," said Miss Tox, keeping up the ball with great sympathy. "And as to porter, quite unlimited, will it not, Louisa?" "Oh, certainly," returned Mrs. Chick, in the same tone. "With a little abstinence, you know, my dear, in point of vegetables." "And pickles, perhaps," suggested Miss Tox. "With such exceptions," said Louisa, "she'll consult her choice entirely, and be under no restraint at all, my love." "And then, of course, you know," said Miss Tox, "however fond she is of her own dear little child, and I'm sure, Louisa, you don't blame her for being fond of it." "Oh, no," cried Mrs. Chick, benignantly. "Still," resumed Miss Tox, "she naturally must be interested in her young charge, and must consider it a privilege to see a little cherub closely connected with the superior classes, gradually unfolding itself from day to day at one common fountain. Is it not so, Louisa?" "Most undoubtedly," said Mrs. Chick. "You see, my love, she's already quite contented and comfortable, and means to say good-bye to her sister Jemima and her little pets, and her good honest husband, with a light heart and a smile. Don't she, my dear?" "Oh, yes," cried Miss Tox. "To be sure she does." Notwithstanding which, however, Poor Polly embraced them all round in great distress, and coming to her spouse at last, could not make up her mind to part with him until he gently disengaged himself at the close of the following allegorical piece of consolation. "Polly, old woman, whatever you do, my darling, hold up your head and fight low. That's the only rule I know on that'll carry anyone through life. You always have held up your head and fought low, Polly. Do it now, or bricks is no longer so, whether my wishes at this moment is to punch this family's head or otherwise. Never mind, God bless you, Polly. Me and Jemima will do our duty by you, and with relating to yours, hold up your head and fight low, Polly, and you can't go wrong." She finally ran away to avoid any more particular leave-taking between herself and the children. But the stratagem hardly succeeded as well as it deserved, for the smallest boy but one, divining her intent, immediately began swarming upstairs after her, if that word of doubtful etymology be admissible, on his arms and legs, while the eldest, known in the family by the name of Byler, in remembrance of the steam engine, beat a demoniacal tattoo with his boots, expressive of grief, in which he was joined by the rest of the family. A quantity of oranges and halfpence thrust indiscriminately on each Tootle checked the first violence of their regret, and the family were speedily transported to their own home by means of the hackney coach kept in waiting for that purpose. The children, under the guardianship of Jemima, blocked up the window and dropped out oranges and halfpence all the way along. Mr. Tootle himself preferred to ride behind among the spikes, as being the mode of conveyance to which he was best accustomed. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 3, in which Mr. Dombey, as a man and a father, is seen at the head of the home department. The funeral of the deceased lady having been performed to the entire satisfaction of the undertaker, as well as of the neighbourhood at large, which is generally disposed to be captious on such a point, and is prone to take offence at any omissions or shortcomings in the ceremonies, the various members of Mr. Dombey's household subsided into their several places in the domestic system. That small world, like the great one out of doors, had the capacity of easily forgetting its dead, and when the cook had said she was a quiet-tempered lady, and the housekeeper had said it was the common lot, and the butler had said, "Who'd have thought it?" and the housemaid had said she couldn't hardly believe it, and the footman had said it seemed exactly like a dream, they had quite worn the subject out, and began to think their mourning was wearing rusty too. On Richards, who was established upstairs in a state of honourable captivity, the dawn of her new life seemed to break cold and grey. Mr. Dombey's house was a large one, on the shady side of a tall, dark, dreadfully genteel street in the region between Portland Place and Bryanstone Square. It was a corner house, with great wide areas containing cellars frowned upon by barred windows, and leered at by crooked-eyed doors leading to dustbins. It was a house of dismal state, with a circular back to it, containing a suite of drawing-rooms looking upon a gravelled yard, where two gaunt trees, with blackened trunks and branches, rattled rather than rustled, their leaves were so smoke-dry. The summer sun was never on the street, but in the morning about breakfast time, when it came with the water carts and the old clothesmen, and the people with geraniums, and the umbrella mender, and the man who trilled the little bell of the Dutch clock as he went along. It was soon gone again, to return no more that day, and the bands of music and the straggling Punch's shows going after it left it a prey to the most dismal of organs and white mice, with now and then a porcupine to vary their entertainments, until the butlers, whose families were dining out, began to stand at the house doors in the twilight, and the lamplighter made his nightly failure in attempting to brighten up the street with gas. It was as blank a house inside as outside. When the funeral was over, Mr. Dombey ordered the furniture to be covered up, perhaps to preserve it for the son to whom his plans were all associated, and the rooms to be ungarnished, saving such as he retained for himself on the ground floor. Accordingly, mysterious shapes were made of tables and chairs, heaped together in the middle of rooms, and covered over with great winding sheets. Bell handles, window blinds, and looking-glasses, being papered up in journals, daily and weekly, obtruded fragmentary accounts of deaths and dreadful murders. Every chandelier or lustre, muffled in Holland, looked like a monstrous tear depending from the ceiling's eye. Odours as from vaults and damp places came out of the chimneys. The dead and buried lady was awful in a picture frame of ghastly bandages. Every gust of wind that rose brought eddying round the corner from the neighbouring mews some fragments of the straw that had been strewn before the house when she was ill, mildewed remains of which was still cleaving to the neighbourhood, and these being always drawn by some invisible attraction to the threshold of the dirty house to let immediately opposite, addressed a dismal eloquence to Mr. Dombey's windows. The apartments which Mr. Dombey reserved for his own inhabiting were attainable from the hall, and consisted of a sitting-room, a library, which was in fact a dressing-room, so that the smell of hot-pressed paper, vellum, morocco, and Russia leather contended in it with the smell of divers pairs of boots, and a kind of conservatory or little glass breakfast-room beyond, commanding a prospect of the trees before mentioned, and, generally speaking, of a few prowling cats. These three rooms opened upon one another. In the morning, when Mr. Dombey was at his breakfast in one or other of the two first mentioned of them, as well as in the afternoon when he came home to dinner, a bell was rung for Richards to repair to this glass chamber, and there walk to and fro with her young charge. From the glimpses she caught of Mr. Dombey at these times, sitting in the dark distance, looking out towards the infant from among the dark heavy furniture, the house had been inhabited for years by his father, and in many of its appointments was old-fashioned and grim. She began to entertain ideas of him in his solitary state, as if he were a lone prisoner in a cell, or a strange apparition that was not to be accosted or understood. Little Paul Dombey's foster mother had led this life herself, and had carried little Paul through it for some weeks, and had returned upstairs one day from a melancholy saunter through the dreary rooms of state. She never went out without Mrs. Chick, who called on fine mornings, usually accompanied by Miss Tox, to take her and the baby for an airing, or, in other words, to march them gravely up and down the pavement, like a walking funeral. When, as she was sitting in her own room, the door was slowly and quietly opened, and a dark-eyed little girl looked in. "It's Miss Florence come home from her aunt's, no doubt," thought Richards, who had never seen the child before. "Hope I see you well, miss." "Is that my brother?" asked the child, pointing to the baby. "Yes, my pretty," answered Richards. "Come and kiss him." But the child, instead of advancing, looked earnestly in the face and said, "What have you done with my mamma?" "Lord bless the little creature!" cried Richards. "What a sad question! I done nothing, miss." "What have they done with my mamma?" inquired the child. "I never saw such a melting thing in all my life," said Richards, who naturally substituted for this child one of her own, inquiring for herself in like circumstances. "Come nearer here, my dear miss. Don't be afraid of me." "I am not afraid of you," said the child, drawing nearer, "but I want to know what they have done with my mamma." "My darling," said Richards, "you wear that pretty black frock in remembrance of your mamma." "I can remember my mamma," returned the child, with tears springing to her eyes, "in any frock." "But people put on black to remember people when they're gone." "Where gone?" asked the child. "Come and sit down by me," said Richards, "and I'll tell you a story." With a quick perception that it was intended to relate to what she had asked, little Florence laid aside the bonnet she had held in her hand until now, and sat down on a stool at the nurse's feet, looking up into her face. "Once upon a time," said Richards, "there was a lady, a very good lady, and her little daughter dearly loved her." "A very good lady, and her little daughter dearly loved her," repeated the child. "Who, when God thought it right that it should be so, was taken ill and died." The child shuddered. "Died never to be seen again by anyone on earth, and was buried in the ground where the trees grow." "The cold ground?" said the child, shuddering again. "No, the warm ground," returned Polly, seizing her advantage, "where the ugly little seeds turn into beautiful flowers, and into grass and corn, and I don't know what all besides. Where good people turn into bright angels and fly away to heaven." The child, who had drooped her head, raised it again and sat looking at her intently. "So, let me see," said Polly, not a little flurried between this earnest scrutiny, her desire to comfort the child, her sudden success, and her very slight confidence in her own powers. "So, when this lady died, wherever they took her, or wherever they put her, she went to God, and she prayed to him, this lady did," said Polly, affecting herself beyond measure, being heartily in earnest, to teach her little daughter to be sure of that in her heart, and to know that she was happy there and loved her still, and to hope and try, all her life, to meet her there one day, never, never, never to part any more. "It was my mamma," exclaimed the child, springing up and clasping her round the neck. "And the child's heart," said Polly, drawing her to her breast. The little daughter's heart was so full of the truth of this, that even when she heard it from a strange nurse that couldn't tell it right, but was a poor mother herself, and that was all, she found a comfort in it, didn't feel so lonely, sobbed and cried upon her bosom, took kindly to the baby lying in her lap. And there, said Polly, smoothing the child's curls and dropping tears upon them. There, poor dear. Oh, well, Miss Floy, and won't your pa be angry neither? Cried a quick voice at the door, proceeding from a short, brown, womanly girl of 14, with a little snub nose and black eyes like jet beads. When it was tickerly given out that you wasn't to go and worrit the wet nurse. She don't worry me, was the surprised rejoinder of Polly. I am very fond of children. Oh, but begging your pardon, Mrs. Richard, that don't matter, you know, returned the black-eyed girl, who was so desperately sharp and biting that she seemed to make one's eyes water. I may be very fond of pennywinkles, Mrs. Richards, but it don't follow that I'm to have 'em for tea. Well, it don't matter, said Polly. Oh, thank'ee, Mrs. Richards, don't it? Returned the sharp girl. Remembering, however, if you'll be so good, that Miss Floy's under my charge, and Master Paul's under yourn. But still we needn't quarrel, said Polly. Oh, no, Mrs. Richards, rejoined Spitfire. Not at all. I don't wish it. We needn't stand upon that footing. Miss Floy being a permanency, Master Paul a temporary. Spitfire made use of none but comma pauses, shooting out whatever she had to say in one sentence and in one breath, if possible. Miss Florence has just come home, hasn't she? asked Polly. Yes, Mrs. Richards, just come, and here, Miss Floy, before you've been in the house a quarter of an hour, you go a-smearing your wet face against the expensive mourning that Mrs. Richards is wearing for your ma. With this remonstrance, young Spitfire, whose real name was Susan Nipper, detached the child from her new friend by a wrench, as if she were a tooth. But she seemed to do it more in the excessively sharp exercise of her official functions than with any deliberate unkindness. She'll be quite happy now she has come home again, said Polly, nodding to her with an encouraging smile upon her wholesome face, and will be so pleased to see her dear papa tonight. Lord, Mrs. Richards, cried Miss Nipper, taking up her words with a jerk. Don't. See her dear papa, indeed. I should like to see her do it. Won't she then? asked Polly. Lork, Mrs. Richards, no, her pa's a deal too wrapped up in somebody else, and before there was a somebody else to be wrapped up in, she never was a favourite. Girls are thrown away in this house, Mrs. Richard, I assure you. The child looked quickly from one nurse to the other, as if she understood and felt what was said. You surprise me, cried Polly. Hasn't Mr. Dombey seen her since? No, interrupted Susan Nipper, not once since, and he hadn't hardly set his eyes upon her before that for months and months, and I don't think he'd have known her for his own child if he had met her in the streets, or would know her for his own child if he were to meet her in the streets tomorrow. Mrs. Richards, as to me, said Spitfire with a giggle, I doubt if he's aware of my existence. Pretty dear, said Richards, meaning not Miss Nipper, but the little Florence. Oh, there's a Tartar within 100 miles of where we're now in conversation, I can tell you, Mrs. Richards. Present company always excepted, too, said Susan Nipper. Wish you good morning, Mrs. Richards. Now, Miss Floy, you come along with me, and don't go hanging back like a naughty, wicked child that judgments is no example to. Don't." In spite of being thus adjured, and in spite also of some hauling on the part of Susan Nipper, tending towards the dislocation of her right shoulder, little Florence broke away and kissed her new friend affectionately. "Good-bye," said the child. "God bless you. I shall come to see you again soon. And you'll come to see me. Susan will let us. Won't you, Susan?" Spitfire seemed to be, in the main, a good-natured little body, although a disciple of that school of trainers of the young idea which holds that childhood, like money, must be shaken and rattled and jostled about a good deal to keep it bright. For, being thus appealed to with some endearing gestures and caresses, she folded her small arms and shook her head and conveyed a relenting expression into her very wide-open black eyes. "It ain't right of you to ask it, Miss Floy, for you know I can't refuse you, but Mrs Richards and me will see what can be done. If Mrs Richards likes, I may wish, you see, to take a voyage to Cheney, Mrs Richards, but I mayn't know how to leave the London docks." Richards assented to the proposition. "This house ain't so exactly ringing with merrymaking," said Miss Nipper, "that one need be lonelier than one must be. Your toxes and your chickses may draw out my 2 front double teeth, Mrs Richards, but that's no reason why I need offer 'em the whole set." This proposition was also assented to by Richards, as an obvious one. "So I'm agreeable, I'm sure," said Susan Nipper, "to live friendly, Mrs Richards, while Master Paul continues a permanency, if the means can be planned out without going openly against orders. But goodness gracious me, Miss Floy, you haven't got your things off yet, you naughty child. You haven't. Come along." With these words, Susan Nipper, in a transport of coercion, made a charge at her young ward, and swept her out of the room. Child, in her grief and neglect, was so gentle, so quiet and uncomplaining, was possessed of so much affection that no one seemed to care to have, and so much sorrowful intelligence that no one seemed to mind or think about the wounding of, that Polly's heart was sore when she was left alone again. In the simple passage that had taken place between herself and the motherless little girl, her own motherly heart had been touched no less than the child's, and she felt, as the child did, that there was something of confidence and interest between them from that moment. Notwithstanding Mr. Tootle's great reliance on Polly, she was perhaps, in point of artificial accomplishments, very little his superior. But she was a good plain sample of a nature that is ever, in the mass, better, truer, higher, nobler, quicker to feel, and much more constant to retain all tenderness and pity, self-denial and devotion, than the nature of men. And perhaps, unlearned as she was, she could have brought a dawning knowledge home to Mr. Dombey at that early day, which would not then have struck him in the end like lightning. But this is from the purpose. Polly only thought, at that time, of improving on her successful propitiation of Miss Nipper, and devising some means of having little Florence beside her, lawfully and without rebellion. An opening happened to present itself that very night. She had been rung down into the glass room as usual, and had walked about and about it a long time, with the baby in her arms, when, to her great surprise and dismay, Mr. Dombey came out suddenly and stopped before her. "Good evening, Richards." Just the same austere, stiff gentleman, as he had appeared to her on that first day. Such a hard-looking gentleman that she involuntarily dropped her eyes and her curtsy at the same time. "How is Master Paul, Richards?" "Quite thriving, sir, and well." "He looks so," said Mr. Dombey, glancing with great interest at the tiny face she uncovered for his observation, and yet affecting to be half careless of it. "They give you everything you want, I hope?" "Oh, yes, thank you, sir." She suddenly appended such an obvious hesitation to this reply, however, that Mr. Dombey, who had turned away, stopped and turned round again inquiringly. "If you please, sir, the child is very much disposed to take notice of things," said Richards, with another curtsy. "And upstairs is a little dull for him, perhaps, sir." "I beg them to take you for airings constantly," said Mr. Dombey. "Very well, you shall go out oftener. You're quite right to mention it." "I beg your pardon, sir," faltered Polly, "but we do go out plenty, sir, thank you." "What would you have, then?" asked Mr. Dombey. "Indeed, sir, I don't exactly know," said Polly, "unless—" "Yes?" "I believe nothing is so good for making children lively and cheerful, sir, as seeing other children playing about 'em," observed Polly, taking courage. "I think I mentioned to you, Richards, when you came here," said Mr. Dombey, with a frown, "that I wished you to see as little of your family as possible. You can continue your walk, if you please." With that he disappeared into his inner room, and Polly had the satisfaction of feeling that he had thoroughly misunderstood her object, and that she had fallen into disgrace without the least advancement of her purpose. Next night she found him walking about the conservatory when she came down. As she stopped at the door, checked by this unusual sight, and uncertain whether to advance or retreat, he called her in. "If you really think that sort of society is good for the child," he said sharply, as if there had been no interval since she proposed it, "where's Miss Florence?" "Nothing could be better than Miss Florence, sir," said Polly eagerly. "But I understood from her little maid that they were not to—" Mr. Dombey rang the bell, and walked till it was answered. "Tell them always to let Miss Florence be with Richards when she chooses, and go out with her, and so forth. Tell them to let the children be together when Richards wishes it." The iron was now hot, and Richards, striking on it boldly, that it was a good cause, and she was bold in it, though instinctively afraid of Mr. Dombey, requested that Miss Florence might be sent down then and there to make friends with her little brother. She feigned to be dandling the child as the servant retired on this errand, but she thought that she saw Mr. Dombey's colour change, that the expression of his face quite altered, that he turned hurriedly, as if to gainsay what he had said, or she had said, or both, and was only deterred by very shame. And she was right. The last time he had seen his slighted child, there had been that in the sad embrace between her and her dying mother, which was at once a revelation and a reproach to him. Let him be absorbed as he would in the son on whom he built such high hopes, he could not forget that closing scene. He could not forget that he had no part in it, that at the bottom of its clear depths of tenderness and truth lay those two figures clasped in each other's arms, while he stood on the bank above them, looking down, a mere spectator, not a sharer with them, quite shut out. Unable to exclude these things from his remembrance, or to keep his mind free from such imperfect shapes of the meaning with which they were fraught, as were able to make themselves visible to him through the mist of his pride, his previous feelings of indifference towards little Florence changed into an uneasiness of an extraordinary kind. He almost felt as if she watched and distrusted him, as if she held the clue to something secret in his breast, of the nature of which he was hardly informed himself, as if she had an innate knowledge of one jarring and discordant string within him, and her very breath could sound it. His feeling about the child had been negative from her birth. He had never conceived an aversion to her. It had not been worth his while, or in his humour. She had never been a positively disagreeable object to him. But now he was ill at ease about her. She troubled his peace. He would have preferred to put her idea aside altogether, if he had known how. Perhaps, who shall decide on such mysteries? He was afraid that he might come to hate her. When little Florence timidly presented herself, Mr. Dombey stopped in his pacing up and down and looked towards her. Had he looked with greater interest and with a father's eye, he might have read in her keen glance the impulses and fears that made her waver, the passionate desire to run clinging to him, crying as she hid her face in his embrace, "Oh, father, try to love me. There's no one else." The dread of a repulse, the fear of being too bold, and of offending him, the pitiable need in which she stood of some assurance and encouragement, and how her overcharged young heart was wandering to find some natural resting place for its sorrow and affection. But he saw nothing of this. He saw her pause irresolutely at the door and look towards him, and he saw no more. "Come in," he said. "Come in. What is the child afraid of?" She came in, and after glancing round her for a moment with an uncertain air, stood pressing her small hands hard together close within the door. "Come here, Florence," said her father coldly. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, papa." "Have you nothing to say to me?" The tears that stood in her eyes as she raised them quickly to his face were frozen by the expression it wore. She looked down again, and put out her trembling hand. Mr. Dombey took it loosely in his own, and stood looking down upon her for a moment, as if he knew as little as the child what to say or do. "There, be a good girl," he said, patting her on the head, and regarding her as it were by stealth, with a disturbed and doubtful look. "Go to Richard's, go." His little daughter hesitated for another instant, as though she would have clung about him still, or had some lingering hope that he might raise her in his arms and kiss her. She looked up in his face once more. He thought how like her expression was then to what it had been when she looked round at the doctor that night, and instinctively dropped her hand and turned away. It was not difficult to perceive that Florence was at a great disadvantage in her father's presence. It was not only a constraint upon the child's mind, but even upon the natural grace and freedom of her actions. Still, Polly persevered with all the better heart for seeing this, and judging of Mr. Dombey by herself, had great confidence in the mute appeal of poor little Florence's morning dress. "It's hard indeed," thought Polly, "if he takes only to one little motherless child, when he has another, and that a girl, before his eyes. So Polly kept her before his eyes as long as she could, and managed so well with little Paul as to make it very plain that he was all the livelier for his sister's company. When it was time to withdraw upstairs again, she would have sent Florence into the inner room to say good night to her father, but the child was timid and drew back, and when she urged her again, said, spreading her hands before her eyes as if to shut out her own unworthiness, "Oh, no, no, he doesn't want me. He don't want me." The little altercation between them had attracted the notice of Mr. Dombey, who inquired from the table where he was sitting at his wine what the matter was. "Miss Florence was afraid of interrupting, sir, if she came in to say good night," said Mrs. Richards. "It doesn't matter," returned Mr. Dombey. "You can let her come and go without regarding me." The child shrunk as she listened, and was gone before her humble friend looked round again. However, Polly triumphed not a little in the success of her well-intentioned scheme, and in the address with which she had brought it to bear, whereof she made a full disclosure to Spitfire when she was once more safely entrenched upstairs. Miss Nipper received that proof of her confidence, as well as the prospect of their free association for the future, rather coldly, and was anything but enthusiastic in her demonstrations of joy. "I thought you would have been pleased," said Polly. "Oh yes, Mrs. Richards, I am very well pleased, thank you," returned Susan, who had suddenly become so very upright that she seemed to have put an additional bone in her stays. "You don't show it," said Polly. "Oh, being only a permanency, I couldn't be expected to show it like a temporary," said Susan Nipper. "Temporaries carries it all before 'em here, I find. But though there's an excellent party wall between this house and the next, I mayn't exactly like to go to it, Mrs. Richards, notwithstanding." Chapter 3